Hello and welcome to HTML and CSS Week 2. My name is Nelson and I will be your instructor. So this week we're going to be playing with some fun stuff. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and review what we talked about last week. We talked about HTML and we talked about web servers, and I want to do a quick recap of that so that people are on the same page. After that, we're going to be taking a look at linking between pages. Then we're going to be talking about CSS a little bit more in depth than we did before. So far we've just gone over what HTML is. We haven't really talked about CSS, what it does, how it works, or how to use it. We'll be talking today about the syntax of CSS and, well, how we can use it to style our pages. And then finally we will wrap things up with a quick overview of some development tools that are available on Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, and I believe Opera that make building websites a lot easier. So to review what we talked about last week, the main thing that we did is we tossed together a very basic HTML page, and we can see the result of that page being rendered by Chrome right here. So we talked about what HTML is, and HTML again is hypertext markup language. It's a way to describe text in a structured way that gets presented to us by special programs called web browsers. And web browsers understand HTML, take what we tell it to do through HTML, and present it to the user in a little window that I'm sure most of you should be familiar with. In fact, if you have arrived at this class, you have used a web browser. So we talked about the different elements that we have available to us in HTML. So if you guys remember, we have what are called tags. So for example, right here we have the title tag and the end title tag. And when you have a tag, what it does is it creates an element. So in this case, we have the title element. What the title element's doing right here is just marking up or giving semantics to the text inside of it. And that's all HTML does. It allows us to mark up, which is why it's called a markup language, text to give it meaning. So not only can we give things meaning in HTML, we can also nest elements within each other to give our documents structure. So as you see in this particular HTML document, we have a very defined structure. We can see the structure very well because of the way the indentation is happening, the way I indented child elements and so on, but that doesn't really matter to the browser. What the browser pays attention to are closing and opening tags. So for example, because we have an opening tag header and a closing tag header here, the browser knows that every single thing that appears within that element is nested within that parent element. So HTML allows us to provide semantics to text. So the bare minimum of a properly formed HTML5 document, it's not actually technically the bare minimum, but it's the bare minimum of what you're going to see 99% of the time, is going to be our doc type, which declares our document to the browser as being HTML5. Our HTML element, which wraps our entire document. As you can see, we have the start tag up there and the end tag right there. Then we have our head. Inside of our head, we must provide or it's highly recommended to provide a character set. In this case, we are using UTF-8. I know we haven't talked about character sets or encoding. That's something that we'll do in a later class. Right now, it's not that important to discuss. But inside of our head, we have a title telling the browser what the title of our page is. And that's really important because not only does it appear here in that tab, but it would also appear if I were to bookmark this page. See, if I were to bookmark it, notice how the bookmark is automatically filled in with the title. So you're always going to want to have a proper title for your HTML documents. Then we have this, which I'm going to completely skip over in the review because this is exactly what this particular week's class is going to be about. So outside of the head, again, the head is a required element that just gives some metadata about our page. It doesn't contain any content, but it helps describe the document to our browser in a variety of different ways. After that, we have our body, and our body contains the actual content that the page is going to render. Inside of our body, we have a header element, which is, again, the reason I said this a lot last week. The reason I used a particular element is because I wanted to do something, and this element was the closest match to what I wanted to do. I wanted to have a header, therefore I used the header element, because it's available to me through HTML5. Inside of our header element, we have a header1 element, which gives us a nice big bold bit of text right there, and it also helps describe the structure of our document. And H1 is typically going to be the title of either the page or the section that we're appearing under. So the way that this works is that we have our H1. Our H1 is inside of a header, and the header is inside of a body. So that means that this H1 is considered to be in the document structure, the header for the entire page, because it's not nested within anything that would change that context. Following our header, we have a paragraph tag, which is just a way to provide text to be rendered as a block inside of our browser. Then we have a section, and we have another H1 inside of that section. And that's interesting because this H1 is not actually related to the parent of the page. It's actually kind of tied to this little section element right here. So we can think of this H1 as a header for this section. In fact, we can see this distinction visually through Chrome, because with Chrome's default styling, an H1 that appears inside of a section is actually a little bit smaller in the font size than the header that's associated with the web page. Now that's not true for all browsers. Not all browsers have that default styling in it, but it does help as a little teaching aid to show the distinction between this H1 element and this H1 element, because they're nested within different containers. Then inside of this section, it is followed by a form element. Now form elements are lots of fun, and we will be using them extensively once we get into JavaScript and ASP.NET. However, at the present moment, we aren't going to be doing any interactivity. So we're not going to be taking advantage of what the form does, but it's important to see its syntax and see how the browser goes about rendering that form for us. Then you'll notice a div. Div stands for divider, and a div is just here to divide elements that I have in a way that I couldn't find a proper HTML element to describe what I wanted to do. So as far as the semantics for the div element, they are non-existent. A div has no semantics. It is just there to be a convenient divider wherever I might need one. You'll also notice that I give it a class. We will be talking about classes later today, so I won't talk too much about that. Inside of this divider, we have a label followed by an input. A label is just a way to describe, well, a label, and an input is just a way to describe a field. But you'll notice something interesting. We actually have two inputs on this page. The first one has a type of text, and the second one has a type of submit. If you guys recall, what we have here are attributes. And an attribute is an identifier such as type or for or name, followed by a value. And they alter the way that the element will behave in the browser. In the case of the input element, we have a variety of different types we can put into the type attribute, such as text or submit. So we talked in depth more about these other attributes during last week's class, so you might want to review that or head on over to the Mozilla Developer Network to check out the documentation of that element. The only thing that's interesting that is in this form other than what I've talked about is the select. And again, a select is a type of way to present a UI widget inside of our browser. So after our form, we have three other sections. We have a to do today, to do tomorrow, and to do in the future. And these sections all have headers. Again, those headers are not these H1s are not headers for the entire document. They're headers for the section that they appear within. Inside of each one of these sections, besides a header, we also have an OL, which stands for unordered list, or wow, ordered list, because order starts with O and stuff. So an ordered list, as you'll see right here, is just a list that has little incrementing numbers next to it. So that's lots of fun. Inside of our ordered lists, we have these LIs, which stand for list items. And inside of them, we have some interesting elements that I was just sort of wanting to show people the expressive power of HTML. For example, we could mark up the text item 1 as being deleted by wrapping it in a del element, or we can emphasize an item, such as item 3, by wrapping it in a strong element. So those are our 3 sections, and those 3 sections are followed by a footer, which again is just an element that describes a footer, and it's called footer because that's what it describes. And I wanted a footer, so I used the footer element, which happens to be called footer, and that's what I did. You can see it being represented down here, but the browser doesn't really do anything special with the footer element. We'll do some fun stuff with the footer element later, though, once we start talking about how CSS works. Now, so that's just a quick review of the HTML itself. If you want anything more in depth, we did, a 2-hour class on it last week. But there's something else that we talked about last week that I didn't really go into too much detail about. And the reason I didn't was because it's a fairly technical topic and it's difficult to describe, but it's necessary if you want to be into web development or web design. It's necessary to understand. We will be taking advantage of the fact that we installed a web server very soon here inside of this class, and you'll start to realize why I wanted to move people away from just dumping HTML files on their file system and instead use a program to serve out those files instead. So let's jump over to a whiteboard, define some few important terms that we did talk about last week, but I want to click on Photoshop. I really want to click on Photo. No, and it's not gonna do it. Hold on. Here we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and define some terms. And I'll be using these terms, extensively throughout this entire class and future classes. So, you should be constrained to this display, and there we go. So, stuff. We have a web browser. And anybody who knows me knows that I do need a few minutes to get fully warmed up with my penmanship here. So we have a web browser. What does a web browser actually do? Well, a web browser, like Chrome, allows us to communicate with web servers. Such as Apache. So this may be Chrome that we're looking at right here, and this may be Apache. Now what you do with the web browser is you type into the address bar a URL. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. A URL is always in this format. Well, it sometimes isn't being displayed in this format, but this is the fully expanded URL, and we will define the different aspects of a fully defined URL. We have something like http:// let's do a real example. I have a you'll notice that I have a Chrome window right here on my host computer. It says 192.168.1.16. This is the IP address of the virtual machine that I have XAMPP running in. So instead of putting in a domain there, I don't want to focus on DNS today. I'll just put in a little IP address. So I'll put in 192.168. What is it? 116:80/week1. I know it's week 2, but well, and as I said the word 2, I should probably stop talking. Example.html. So what do we have here? This is a URL, and it's broken up into a bunch of different sections. We have our protocol, which is this guy. What's a protocol? Well, a protocol is a way, an understood language. See, HTTP is a language that's understood by both web browsers and web servers. So when a web browser talks to a web server, it communicates with the HTTP protocol. Next up, we have our address of the server. Our browser needs to know who it's communicating with. You can't go to a web browser and not typing anything into the address bar and expect to get somewhere. You have to type something in that uniquely identifies the server you're locating, whether that be 3dbuzz.com or google.com, or even a local computer on my network right here. Then we have a port. HTTP has a default port of 80, so it can actually be omitted entirely, and you won't often see a port being added to a URL. But you can just pretend that whenever you look at a URL, there is a :80 right there, unless there's another port specified. In fact, Chrome also chops off the protocol. So that would be an example of a full URL. Then we have the path. And here is the path of this URL. There's actually a few other elements to URLs that we won't really be taking advantage of, but I'll mention them just for the sake of completeness. Have you guys ever seen something like this? Like the pound followed by something? Or actually, that's not first. Whoops. Ignore me. I meant to put a question mark. Okay, so we have that little thing. And what is that little thing? That's called the query string. This is the query string, and it contains information that the web browser or the web server can take advantage of. Finally, after all of this stuff, we have the fragment. So we have a protocol, an address, a port, a path, a query string, and a fragment. And that's very typical of a URL structure. The path isn't optional. Obviously, you need a path always, even if it's blank. The query string and fragments are optional. The port is optional if it's port 80, and that's it. So we have a fragment, a query string, path, port, address, protocol. And with all of this information, this information allows you to uniformly locate a resource, which is handy because that's what URL stands for, Uniform Resource Locator. So what happens when we type in this URL and the web browser talks to the server? Well, the web browser will go ahead and say, okay, I need to know who I'm talking to. That's step one. I'm talking to 192.168.1.16. Okay, so I know who I'm talking to. I need to know what port I'm talking on, because web servers can only listen on, you have to tell them which ports they're going to listen on, and we need to identify which port we're going to be talking about. Remember, the :80 is optional if you're using 80 because that's the default. So that's the first step. We identify who we're talking to and what port. Then we tell the web server, I want the information at this path. So week1/example.html. So what's going to happen? Well, honestly, anything could happen. I can write a web server that'll take any path and it'll return the same content whenever I want. But that's not very useful. The way Apache is going to work is we have what's called our document root. And our document root in this case is going to be C/XAMPP /htdocs. So when our web browser goes in and says, hey, Mr. Web Server, I want example.html, the web server is going to look at its document root, append what we're looking for on top of the document root, and then serve it back to the web browser. So I hope this notation makes some sense. The idea is that we take the path that we're asking, that we know who we're talking to. We know the web server that we're talking to. We ask them for a path. Typically what's going to happen, this doesn't happen all the time. There's a lot of cases where this doesn't happen actually. But for the sake of example, what's happening right here is that we're requesting a particular path. Apache will append whatever path we're looking for onto its document root, find that file, and send it back in an HTTP response. Wow. And then our browser does something with the document. Now typically what it's going to do is it's going to take the document that was returned and display it to us, which is exactly what's happening right here. We're going to 192.168.1.16 at 80 with /week1/example.html. When we go to that URL, our web browser, or our web server, is going to navigate into its document root, which in this case is under XAMPP htdocs week1 example.html. Alrighty. That's really all about all that people will need to understand about web servers to be able to work with them. And that's the whole point. We need to be able to work with them in order to build designs or applications that run on a web server. You might be thinking, well, wait a sec, why do I care about how a web server works if I'm just going to be a designer? Well, hopefully by the end of this lesson, that will become very apparent. Because the first thing we're going to be talking about today are anchors, or more specifically, hyperlinks. So the whole point of the web, in fact, you can just hear it in the name, the web, is to be able to have a bunch of interconnected documents that can be accessed through a URL. And you typically access these other documents through a URL by clicking on a link. So how do we create links, and how do links work, and how do we avoid being very confused when working with links? So let's start off with that. I'm going to take this example.html, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to create another folder called week2, and I'm going to paste it in here. So now if I go to my web browser and I type in week2 as the path, hey, look, I get the same thing. And that's just because I copied and pasted the file. So let's talk about anchors. If I go ahead and fire up my editor and wait a year, maybe 2 years, editor, wonderful. Hold on, my VM is having a little fit here. So people are asking, like, what are URL fragments? Well, yeah, those are used to scroll to a portion of a page if you wanted to. They're also abused for other purposes, like, hey, everybody in BuzzNet, go ahead and look at the top of BuzzNet. What do you see? You see a URL fragment. Okay, hold on. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. And we're back. Sorry about that. VM had a little fit. So let's talk about links. What if I wanted, just as a quick example, what if I wanted to have 2 pages in this program or in this application? What if I wanted to have my add an item on a separate page that wasn't just also displaying my actual to-dos? Well, the first thing that you would do is you would go ahead and create another HTML file. So let's go ahead and create a add item .html. And I'm going to open it up in Sublime Text. I'm going to go ahead and pull down some boilerplate HTML. Type this out, get my document structure going. And I'll change the title to to-do application dash add item. Okay, so what do I want to do here? Let's go ahead and give it a header. I want this page to have a header with an h1 tag of, I don't know, how about to-do application dash add item. And then let's give it a little description. Add a to-do item. Sure. Then let's go ahead and put in a footer where I'm just going to repeat what I had before. So copyright, what was the format I put that in again? 2013 Nelson LeKay. Finally, what I want to do is I said I wanted to move the form over into a different page that we could link to with an A tag. So let's do that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this entire form and I'm going to cut it with Control X, move it over to add item and paste it in. And that's it. So whoops. I meant to do a /p right there to close the p tag properly. So what we have here is a simple page that has a form in it. Notice how I'm not using any section tags. I'm not using, or section elements. I'm not using any section elements because there aren't multiple sections to this document. This document has one logical section, in my opinion, and therefore I don't need to delineate it from any other sections. So that's great. So if I go back here and refresh, notice how my form disappears. That makes perfect sense, right? Because we moved it from this document to another document. Let's take a look at what our other document looks like. What did I name that guy? I named him add-item. So we moved the form from this document to this document. And that's great. But we don't actually have any way to link between the two. And that's the problem that we're going to be solving right now. What I want to do is I want to create a hyperlink on add an item to go to this page. And I want this page to have another link to go back to the other page. There's actually an interesting thing that we could take advantage of. And I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of it here. And that's the nav element. HTML5 introduced a navigation element, which is great. So I'm going to remove this section entirely, and I'm going to add a nav element up here. And inside of the nav element, I'm going to add something that'll look really crazy. An A tag. Let's take a look at what the A tag looks like first. If I go ahead and refresh, look at that. There's now an add an item link right up here in my header. And if I click on it, it takes me to the add item page. So that is a hyperlink. Hyperlinks are created with the A tag. A stands for anchor. The only thing that's interesting about A tags for now, we can do some other fun stuff with A tags, but that's not important right now. What's important is this attribute right here, the href. Or I think that stands for hyperlink reference or something. But either way, what the href attribute does is it tells our A tag where it needs to navigate the browser to when the user clicks on it. Then inside of the A tag, we give it our whatever we want the link to appear as, what text we want it to appear as. So if I go back to add an item, and I'll go into his little nav element inside the header, I can go ahead and do the same thing. I can create an A tag with an href of example.html and a link text of back to to-do list. Now I've established linking between two pages. There are a lot of problems with what we have so far, and we will be discussing them in depth. But the way that I think most people are looking at this is, well, that seems pretty straightforward enough. But like I said, there's lots of things you have to keep into consideration with working with links, and that's why I'm dedicating an entire section of this particular class to talk about it. So, how's everyone feeling about hyperlinks? You have an A tag, you give it an href attribute, and you point it to another page. Okay, so that's interesting, but there's some problems with A tags, and that's the way that pathing works on a web server. And this is the way pathing works on a web server is the exact reason why I want people to be using one, even if they're not interested in the technical side of things. I want people to use a web server because it'll give them a very realistic look into how their pages are going to actually behave when deployed into production. And that behavior typically stems from naive implementations of pathing. So this href can take in a lot of stuff. Like, for example, I could do this. So if I hit refresh, I can click on 3D Buzz, and hey, I'm taken right to 3D Buzz. So we can put in partial things, partial bits of a path. This is an example of a path that will be on the current web server that we're located at on the browser, and it's going to be a relative path to the directory that we're currently in. Or we can have entire URLs where we define our protocol, and our address, and optionally our paths, query strings, and fragments as well. So that's also fun. We have two examples of hyperlinks right here. But things start to get tricky once we start wanting to reference documents that may be in different subfolders than our current document. For example, what if I wanted my URL to look something like this? Instead of add-item, what if I wanted to have it look like item/add.html? So when I type in item/add.html, I get an object not found. Specifically, I get a 404. And that's because the file doesn't exist yet. So what we could do is, with a little bit of renaming action, we could go ahead and create a new folder called item, or how about items? That sounds better. And then we can rename our add item to add.html, and then we can dump it right up here in items. Okay, so now I can go to items/add.html and I get this. So that's cool. But two things are broken. The first thing that's broken is our add an item link now goes to a 404 because add-item.html no longer exists. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the href of this tag to go to items/add.html. Go back here, refresh, and hit add an item. So now we have an example of a good URL structure that allows us to move forward into another folder inside of our web server. So that's really cool. But now we have a problem. We have this back to to-do list. And if I click on it, look what happens. Back to to-do list, if I open that up in my editor, you'll see what it is a special kind of path called a relative path. And again, if you think this stuff is simple or unimportant or not interesting, this will be the cause of misery for a lot of your web development as you start off, or web design as you start off. So this is important stuff. What we have here is a relative path. When I click on a relative path, it will not only use the same web server that we're already connected to, as the URL it navigates to, but it'll also use every path that we had, or our path that we were previously at, and append on whatever we typed in. So this is problematic. What happens if we did .. As some of you know, that's a common way to navigate up in a directory tree. So what we can do is we can now have a ... which allows us to navigate down or up our directory tree and navigate to a parent item. So now we have an example of moving forward and moving backwards within a directory by using relative pathing. So that's really interesting. But the more files, the more web pages, and the more style sheets and JavaScript scripts and so on that we have in our page, the more complicated our URL scheme will be, and using relative pathing like this may become difficult. Now, not entirely impossible, but it may become difficult and difficult to maintain. So we have two more options other than relative pathing that we can work with. The first one is absolute pathing. So instead of doing /example.html, I could do /week2.example.html. This is an absolute path for the current web server that I'm on. By doing a /week2example.html, it'll navigate me to the same web server, but I get complete control over the entire path. Meaning I explicitly define that I want to go to week2example.html. I don't want anything to be appended or prepended to that string at all. It looks like there is a little bit of confusion about relative pathing with .. is just the syntax of moving up in a directory. And that's a common convention that's used for, well, paths in pretty much everything, including file systems. So .. just moves up one directory. So notice how we're in week2/items right now. .. will move us up one directory, then go to example.html. So if I click on back to to-do list, we now are in example.html, but notice what happened to the items directory. It disappeared. As I move back and forward through these links, you'll notice the items directory disappeared entirely. That's what the .. does. Okay, so we have an example of relative pathing. We have an example of absolute pathing. I believe it's week2/example.html. And that's great, because remember that when we have resources that are loaded by our web browser, oh, hold on, we got some crazy stuff going on here. Well, we have resources that are loaded by our web browser. They're all loaded relative to, or if they're relative, they're all loaded relative to whatever thing we're looking at right now. And you might want to organize things into subdirectories, or you might want to use a technique known as URL rewriting in order to make your URLs look very nice and not have these nasty little .html extensions to them, or .php extensions. So what you need to do is you need to pay very close attention to the way you do pathing and the way you have your anchor tags and the way you have your link tags working. And we'll talk about link tags here very shortly. The final option, and one of the more common options if you insist on using relative pathing, is I'm going to go ahead and talk about a new HTML element. So I have example.html. Now, let's say I have two links that I want to go to the root of my web page. So let's say I have example.html and then I have other page.html back to other page. And I want both of these to go up one directory. Well, I could prefix every single relative path in my entire project with .. to go up one directory. That's an option, but it's not a very good option. If you're going to go with something like this, there's one more HTML element I want to talk about before getting off the subject of pathing. And as long as my Sublime text stops lagging, we can actually get this done. And that is the base tag. So what I can do is in my head, I can go ahead and type in base. By the way, base is not very well known in beginner sort of tutorials and stuff. I wish that I had learned about this tag when I started doing web development, so that's why I'm including it here. The base element allows us to specify where our project is physically located, or what we want everything to be prepended to our relative URLs. So what I could do is say base href week 2 if I wanted to. By doing that, every single, hold on, I lost my Chrome window. Oh, I didn't lose my Chrome window, it's just that my VM likes to stay on top of it. By using the base tag, we can prepend something to every single one of our relative URLs. Base has been around for a very long time and will be used in every single browser that you have, so don't worry about using it. Base is just a way to define where the base of our project is, and it makes managing relative pathed resources a lot easier. Now, typically, if you're writing an application in a web application framework, you typically will be generating absolute URLs left and right, but it's good to keep in mind how relative URLs work and relative resources work, and especially good to keep in mind the fact that we can use the base tag in order to anchor all of our hrefs into a single directory. So that's interesting. But so I just wanted to throw out a bunch of terminology, talk about pathing, talk about the base because that will save a lot of headache. Point out the fact that I guarantee you most of you guys here are going to, once you start getting to web development, your number one frustration, or one of your frustrations, is going to be with pathing. So I didn't want this to be necessarily comprehensive, but I wanted it to be a basic overview about how that sort of stuff works, because it's going to come into play very shortly here when we talk about CSS. So on that note, it's actually pretty much about time that I am going to be talking about CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this diagram open, and we're going to take a short break and come back and get into style sheets and how we can use them. So yeah, and we're back. So we reviewed pathing. Pathing is awesome. I just wanted to introduce terms to people. You don't necessarily have to completely understand it yet. Understanding will come in time as you play around with things. What I wanted to make everybody very aware of, however, is that pathing is not magic, and there are very specific rules as to how it works. You don't have to know all of the rules, but knowing that there are things such as relative paths, absolute paths, the base element, and so on, will help you as you start to actually make more complicated applications. So let's jump back into the VM and talk about what style sheets are. So we have a very basic application right here. It's not even an application. We have a very basic document right here that describes the layout, or not the layout, but the structure of our page. And we have data inside of our page that's being structured through the use of HTML. HTML is used to construct, well, structure. I know that sounds redundant, but it's true. So the most interesting thing about web applications is not the structure that we build. The structure that we build is very, 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 very important, but it's not what makes things interesting to look at or even functional. What we need to do is we need to have some way to describe to the browser how we want a particular page to look. We've seen an example of this already. You'll notice I have this little style tag up here, and inside of the style tag I have a bunch of crazy stuff, and this crazy stuff makes stuff look different. This crazy stuff is called CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and we'll talk about what I mean by cascading very shortly. The first thing that I want to discuss about CSS, before I break down its syntax, is that CSS, well, again, I defined it as what makes our page look different, but we typically do not put CSS inline in our pages. The reason I've been talking so much about pathing is we need a way to have a CSS file that's shared by multiple pages within our application. And I think that's very important to understand when you start working with CSS. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how we can get this text into a document that is served in one location to both example.html and add.html, where we only have one place that we need to modify our application style. You'll notice that if I jump into add an item, let me go ahead and remove that other nav item because we're not using it. My form looks different than it did when it was up here on example.html. That's because I styled the form with a style sheet. However, that style sheet is inlined inside of HTML or example.html. So let's break it out. To break it out, what we need to do is we need to create a CSS file. And a CSS file is just a text file like HTML that ends with .css. So let's make it. I'm going to create a file called styles.css. Hit enter, hit yes. I'm going to open up that file in my editor. I'm going to go back into my example.html. I'm going to cut all of the stuff that's in the style tag. I'm going to cut it, Control X, and I'm going to paste it right into styles.css. Or then I'm going to remove the style element. Now if we go back to example.html, notice how our styling disappeared. We no longer have any styling information. So how do we go about getting our browser to pull down another file in order to style our application? Well, we do so with another special tag that we place inside of our head. Again, this has to be placed inside of the head. Don't ever place what the tag I'm about to show inside the body. And that tag is called link. Now, the link tag has lots of fun stuff with it. But what we're going to be focusing on mainly are two attributes that are required when working with style sheets. The first one is href. Hey, that looks similar to what we've already encountered quite a few times. And the href is, what is this link tag linking to? Or what is the URL that we need to link to? What we put in this href is a path. It could be an absolute path, it could be a relative path, it could be a path on a completely different web server. In fact, if I wanted to right now, I could link to the style sheet of 3dbuzz.com. For whatever reason, it wouldn't really work well with this document, but it would work. I could do that. So what I want to do though, is I want to link it to my styles.css file. So I just do that. Now, you'll be asking yourself, well, how do I know that I just type in styles.css and they'll just magically work? Well, that leads back to our discussion about pathing. The styles.css file, because it exists within the same directory as my example.html, it will be located with a relative path just fine. But we're not done yet. We have a link, and the link has an href, but the browser doesn't actually know what kind of thing we're linking to. The browser knows where we're linking to, it just doesn't know what kind of thing we're linking to. So we have to tell it with rel. And rel stands for relation. There's a variety of link relations that you can use, but we're just going to be using style sheet for now. And that just tells the browser, I want to go to this path, download this file, and use it as a style sheet for my page. Now if I go back to the page and hit refresh, look what happened. Our style sheet's now being applied. We know it's being applied because our items that were marked with the del element are now red instead of having a strike through. Alrighty, so we've linked our style sheet to our example.html. But again, when we go to our add item, our styles aren't being applied to this page because this is a completely separate document. We have to repeat ourselves in the other document and also tell it where it needs to get its style sheet from. So I'll do that right there. Now, how does this work? Well, this works because we have a base up here, and this is a relative path. If I did not have the base right here, if I removed it entirely, this would not be it would be valid, but it wouldn't work. The reason it wouldn't work is because our add.html file is in a separate directory from our styles.css file. So we have two options. We can use a relative path with a dot dot slash. That would work. We could use an absolute path, or we can use a base. Now what happens if we jump back into the page and hit refresh? Notice what, well, just happened when I hit refresh. We now have styles being applied to our form elements. And you know that they're there because of the fancy little dotted line, or I think that's a dashed line, and our fancy little background on our add task. So that's pretty cool, actually. We now have a style sheet that's being shared between two pages in our document. And anytime we go into the styles.css file and update it, it'll be applied to both pages. Okay, so for right now, we'll just take that for granted because I do want to get into a discussion of what CSS actually does and how it works. We'll be getting back to how the style sheet's being loaded into our application at the end of this video once we start talking about the Chrome development tools. So what we have here is we have an application that has two pages, and we have a style sheet that's shared between both pages. What exactly is a style sheet? Well, let's talk about that. Oh, come on. Hold on. Come on. There you go. Let's talk about what a style sheet is and what CSS looks like and how it actually goes about styling our pages. This is incredibly important stuff. Oh, look at me. I wrote on the background. Wow. I failed. Okay. So, style sheets. Style sheets contain rules. So let's put together a simple style sheet here just on the whiteboard and break down the anatomy of what CSS is. So let's start off with a dot form, wow. Form dash row. And he has a little open curly and maybe a color that is equal to blue. Seriously? And then we might have another rule that looks like section H1 that gets opened, and let's give it a font size of 20 pt, 20 points. So here's my example style sheet. A style sheet is broken up into what are called rules. A rule is what we have right here. Oops. I'll just point to them. We have a rule right here, and we have a rule right here. So this is an example with a style sheet that has two rules. And what is a rule? A rule is always a collection of selectors and properties. So we have a style sheet. A style sheet contains rules. A rule is a list of selectors followed by a list of properties. That is it. There's no more magic to CSS whatsoever. At a high level, all we have are rules, selectors, and properties, and that's pretty much all there is. When we learn CSS, all we are learning are the different bits of syntax that we can use for selectors and the different bits of properties that we have access to. Other than that, it's just a matter of reading the documentation. But it's important to understand what selectors and properties actually do. So we did get a quick question about why we put a period in front of this selector and not right here. We will talk about that. So we have form row. form cow. You know, that does kind of look like a cow, doesn't it? Well, now it's smaller, but whatever, you guys get on what I'm saying. So anyway, we have selectors and properties. What's a selector? A selector is a special bit of syntax that allows us to identify which elements of an HTML document that we should apply the following properties to. The properties that we apply to elements that match our selectors are within these little curly braces. We can apply as many of them as we want. But we need to know where those selectors are, or where those properties are being applied to, and that's the rule. That's the goal of a selector. A selector, again, selects elements based off a special little bit of syntax that we can take advantage of in CSS. There are many, many, many kinds of selectors, and we won't be getting into all of them, but we'll be getting into the ones that are most commonly used. Let's talk about the different selectors we have. We have an example of two selectors, or two kinds of selectors on the screen right here. We have the class selector, and we have an element selector. We also have a selector that has a child. You'll notice that I have section space h1. Well, that's also a kind of selector and allows us to select things within each other, but we'll talk about that here in a moment. First, we'll go ahead and discuss our class selectors and our element selectors. So an element selector could look like this. So dot stuff. Dot stuff is a class selector. Meaning that any element that has a class equal to stuff will be selected. So by doing this in CSS and this in HTML, we can select anything that has a particular class. So let's see an example of that. I'm going to jump back into my VM and I'm going to create another page. And this other page that I'm going to create is just going to be a little test bed for the different selectors we're going to be playing with. So I'm going to create a new HTML document and I'm going to call it test.html. I'm going to open it up in my editor eventually. Then I'm going to cut and paste all this stuff. I'm actually going to delete all of this stuff in here. And I'm going to rename this page to test. Okay, so all I did was I created a test.html, brought in the style sheet, and that's it. Let's put in some HTML. Let's say I have a divider, or how about this? Here's a better example. Let's say I have a p tag, and inside of the p tag I have two strong elements. I have hey there, strong stuff, and then strong and things. A very common thing in CSS is we need to know how we can pick out or select a element. I want to identify this element right here, this strong tag right here. Now, there's no difference as far as the HTML between these two strong tags, so let me go ahead and make a difference. I'm going to make a difference by inserting a class attribute. Now, class attribute can be applied to any element that would appear inside of your body tag, including the body tag itself, actually. And what I could do here is I can do class equals special dash strong. If I go to the page right now, I get hey there, colon, stuff and things. That's because both my stuff and my and things are wrapped in strongs, therefore by default they're styled to be bolded. But I actually did something a little bit special to this strong tag. I gave it a class. which means I can now go into my style sheet eventually, and I can put in a class selector that will select it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all of these rules because we're going to be rewriting these as we learn more about CSS. So how do I go about uniquely identifying this element? Well, he has a class called special-strong. So let's use a class selector. So right here we have a selector of special-strong. This is a class selector. And then inside of it, I can give it special properties. So here's a rule. This is a very simple CSS rule that we're looking at. And so check this out. We have a selector right here, and we know it's a class selector because it has a period in front of it. The class that we're selecting on is special-strong. This is the syntax for a class selector. We're selecting off a class, and we're giving it this property, color equals blue. So now what do you think this is going to look like? Well, when I hit F5, watch that. It says, hey there, stuff, and then in blue, and things. With CSS, we are able to uniquely select any element that we want on the page, given that we have, classes and IDs and elements and all that fun stuff. We'll talk about those selectors in a moment. And we can give them properties. And that's CSS. That's all CSS thing it is. That's it. I'm not kidding. CSS is a selector followed by properties. And that's it. There are all sorts of selectors that we can use in CSS. So let's talk about another one. Let's say I have a another p tag that I open up. I'm getting some really, really awful lag here on my virtual machine. I'm not sure exactly what's causing it. Oh, come on. Okay, so what we have going on here is a p tag where we have text inside of it, and inside the text we have two specially marked up elements, or two specially marked up bits of text. We've marked them up with the small tag, or the small element. So what if we wanted to select every single small element on our page and give it properties? Well, that's going to be using our element selector. So here is a class selector. Everything with class equals special strong. And then we have our element selector. Selects everything with, or selects everything that is a small element. Now if I go back to the page and hit refresh, look how I made my small elements appear red. So we have our class selector and we have our element selector. Those are the two most common selectors you will ever use. Somebody did ask a good question. Does small come with formatting already applied to it? It does. Very typically small on most browsers, or all of them if I'm not mistaken, the text will appear slightly smaller than the text around it. But remember, the styles that your browser applies to HTML by default is dependent on the browser itself. There are techniques to normalize this. In fact, one of the techniques is called Normalize, which is a little project that you can go download and stuff, and it's lots of fun, but we're not going to get into that. So I want to point something out right here, because another thing did come in. Is there a small caps element? The answer is no, and I'm glad that there isn't. Remember, HTML is about defining the structure of our document and giving our text semantics. CSS is about giving those elements special presentational properties. You don't define fonts or colors or positioning or anything like that in HTML. You only define your document structure. CSS allows us to give our elements special appearance depending on a variety of factors. So again, between class selectors and element selectors, those are the two most common selectors in existence. But as you can probably tell by now, things get very, very, very complicated because we can mix and match all of the selector types into very convoluted compound selectors, and we can apply all sorts of properties to them. We'll be discussing how those properties get computed very soon here, because it is a very real possibility that you will create style sheets that conflict with itself or conflict with each other, and we'll be talking about that. So let's talk about another type of selector that you will see commonly, but I don't really like. Come on. Come on. There you go. So let's say actually, hold on. Here's a great example. Remember how we had in our other page, we had a header with an H1 in it, and then we had sections with their own H1s? Okay, so we have a very important problem right here, where we need to be able to uniquely identify which H1s we're looking at when we go to style them, because we most likely don't want our page header to have the same styling as our section header. Now, I want to quickly say something. Finding out or coming up with a way to select an element with CSS is going to be your biggest challenge with CSS. Being able to very cleanly identify all of your elements and style them accordingly is the biggest challenge, which is why I'm spending so much time in the selector aspect of the rule and not so much time on the property aspect. We'll get into some more advanced properties next week. The most important thing right now are the selectors. So what if we wanted to identify or select this element with CSS and give it some special properties to make it display a little bit differently, or that we wouldn't want to display on this particular element? Well, there is one more selector that is in common use, but I don't like very much. That's called the ID selector. The ID selector is a selector that selects an element based off ID, which I realize is incredibly redundant to say out loud, but again, that's how it is. Every element inside of an HTML document can be given an ID. So what I can call this, I can say site-header. And what I have here is an element that has an ID attribute attached to it. Now, IDs must be unique within the page. You cannot have multiple elements that have the same ID. That will get very, very confusing. But now that I've given my H1 an ID, I've said this is the site header. How do I select based off of that? Well, there's one more selector that I want to talk about real fast, and that's the ID selector. ID selectors start off with a pound sign. So this is an ID selector. Selects everything with ID equals site header, which should only be one thing. So here's our ID selector. It's just pound followed by the name. So if I go back and refresh, notice how my page header is now yellow, but my section header is not. That's because I've selected this particular element based off its ID attribute and nothing else. Yeah, the yellow is pretty bad, but that's not the point. So again, I don't particularly like ID selectors, and I would very much recommend that people try to do things without them. And there are a variety of reasons. The biggest one is it makes your code less reusable. Because, yeah, I have an ID selector that selects something and makes it yellow, but what if I wanted to reuse the same rule somewhere else? I couldn't do that. The reason I couldn't do that is because we've coupled our ID to our style sheet, and IDs can only appear once on a page. Therefore, this styling can only ever appear once on the page. So there are other reasons why you should avoid IDs. You'll see them used a lot. I use them on occasion, but I would stick with classes. But there's actually a better solution for this problem. This is not the most optimal solution to the problem. Remember, the problem is I want to select the H1 that appears in my header element. I don't want to select the H1 that appears inside of my section element. So how can I solve this problem without using ID tags? Well, let me go ahead and remove this ID, because we no longer will need it. So there's a better way to do it. Here's the descendant selector. So what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at two selectors that are tied to each other. They're tied to each other because they're separated by space right here. What I am saying right here is I am saying only select H1 elements that appear inside of header elements. So what I've done is I have successfully selected this element without introducing any unsemantic markup into my document. So, yep, we can select by descendants. And I can mix and match too. Like, let's say that I have my strong tags inside of my section, and then I might have a footer, and that footer might have a strong element. So this is my strong footer. What if I wanted to select every single strong tag, or let's say I wanted to select every single special strong, which I'll give that class here, that appears inside of a footer? How do I do that? Well, I can use the descendant selector. I can say inside of the footer, I want to select every special strong, and I want to give it the color of red. You can mix and match all the selectors to whatever degree you want. You can have element selectors that have that are descendant to a class selector that is descendant to an ID selector, and so on and so on and so on. You can get as crazy as you want. But the point is that by coming up with creative combinations of these selectors, you can typically get away with writing markup that is as close to clean as possible without introducing unnecessary things such as ID tags, or sometimes you can even get away with not even introducing classes for some things. Now when I refresh, notice how my footer becomes red. Okay, there's one more selector I want to talk about before I will address the question that might be in some people's heads right now. The question that might be in people's heads right now is, look at line 3 and look at line 22. Remember, this strong right here will be selected by this rule, but it will also be selected by this rule. And we know it's going to be selected by this rule is because it is a an element with the class of special strong underneath the footer. We know that because we can look at the document and say, hey, there's a special strong with the element with the class of special strong underneath the footer. So we know that's happening. But we also know that it's being matched by this one because it has a special strong class. So the question people might be wondering is, how does CSS know how to combine properties? For now, I'm just going to leave that question kind of stewing in people's heads. That's kind of a different discussion. I probably shouldn't have used this as a particular example, but I thought it would be interesting. But yeah, so we will definitely get into that soon. But there are a couple more selectors I want to talk about. Let's say I have a unordered list. And inside of the unordered list, I have a list item. And this list item has a, I don't know, strong item 1, strong, and then, let's give it an H2. And then it also has a P tag. Which describes item 1. And then inside of the LI, we also have another UL. And we have another LI inside of it, and we'll call this with an H3 sub item 1, H3 LI. Okay, so this is a bit of a contrived example. But we have a UL, an unordered list with the list item, with an H2, a paragraph, and another unordered list with an list item with an H3. So a bit of contrived HTML, but believe me when I say this is not the most complicated HTML that you will run into. And as a designer, especially, and as a developer, it's going to be your job to be able to reach into elements and select the ones you want. Well, first of all, what I'm going to do, actually, is I'm going to add one more element to this. Then I'm going to ask you guys a question. Okay, how do we uniquely style this paragraph tag, but not this paragraph tag? How can we write a selector that will select only this, but not this? Now, a person who's new to CSS might say, well, we can add a class to this, and we can call this class top level. And then we can write a CSS rule that does just top level. And we can get away with it like that. But there's a better way. NATO got close, but you'll see what's going on here. The first thing I want to do is I want to give this UL a class. First of all, I want to give this UL a class with item list. And then I want to remove this class from the P tag. So I want to, sorry about that, I meant to leave this as item list because I don't want to style every single UL in this page. I only want to style this particular one. So how do we get to this P tag and nothing else? Let me go ahead and create another item, actually. Let's make this more interesting. There we go. So I want to select this and I want to select this. So let's go ahead and see how that code would look. The first implementation somebody would try to write would look like this. Dot item list li p. Color orange. That's how someone would try to write it, but let's take a look at what will happen if we do that. Because it's close, but not quite exactly what we want. We did successfully select our first top-level P elements, but we also selected the descendant ones too, and that's not what we want. Because if we look at this selector right here, we have an example of a descendant selector, and descendant selectors will select anything no matter how deep in the relationship they appear. Because this P tag is parented to an LI somewhere, and because this LI tag is somewhere parented to an item list, an element with the item list class, it's going to select everything. What we need to use is called the immediate descendant selector. We want to grab just the P that is immediately parented to the LI, that is immediately parented to an item list. We don't want to grab a P that's immediately parented to an LI that's eventually parented to an item list. We want the one that's immediately parented to the LI that's immediately parented to the LI. You know what I'm saying. So we introduce the immediate descendant selector. Instead of delineating our selectors with a space, we can use our greater than sign to denote an immediate relationship with something. So if I go back to this page, look at this. I've only selected out these two p tags, and we've ignored these two p tags, which is exactly what we want. Now the wonderful thing about this is because we didn't have to add many non-semantic elements to our HTML. We did have to throw in a class because I didn't want to style every single UL. Most importantly, if I didn't have this class right here, then these would be matched too. And the reason they would also be matched is because they also appear under an LI that's immediately under a UL. So yeah, the class is necessary. But other than that, we have successfully selected an item without actually making our document look ugly. And that is the core to CSS. A lot of these selectors people will not use when they start working with CSS, and that's just because CSS is a completely separate new language that you have to sort of learn how to think like, I guess you could say, and that comes with experience. But what I really want to show people are just the variety of ways we can mix and match these basic elements in order to come up with some behavior that's actually non-trivial. So again, CSS is a combination of selectors and properties. So we have our ID selectors, class selectors, element selectors, descendant selectors, immediate descendant selectors. But we have one more problem. And that's the problem I talked about before with what we have here on line 22 and what we have here on line 3. Notice how I'm styling special-strong and I'm giving it this color, but I'm doing that on two rules. But these rules are different in a very important way. Let me go ahead and move these two rules next to each other. The way CSS works is that it will apply everything in this rule to the element that appears right here. And it'll also apply everything that's in this rule to the same element. But this property will always override this property. The reason this property here on line 8 will always override the property on line 4 is because this rule has a larger weight. Weight is a concept that is used very heavily in how CSS works, and it's a concept of precedence. Because this selector is more complicated than this selector, every property inside of this rule will have a higher weight value than every property inside of this rule. So this selector is more complicated because we have an element selector and a class selector. We have two things here, whereas this one is just a class selector. So because x plus y, where y is greater than 0, is always larger than x, we can determine that this is always going to override this rule. So does that kind of sort of make sense? Is everybody kind of getting the concept of weight here? The idea is that the more complicated the selector, the higher the weight. That's it. And that's all you need to know right now. There are ways to calculate it yourself, but that gets a little bit out of scope. So again, this week is all about selectors. So don't feel a little bit discouraged that all we're doing is changing the color and font styles of things. Because at the end of the day, selectors are pretty much all that matters in CSS. The properties we'll talk about next week will allow us to position things and create things like drop downs and fun stuff like that. But you need to know how to select things first. And that's where this bit of the course comes into play. So those are all the selectors I want to go over. I do want to point out one more thing, just for the sake of completeness. You can combine selectors. Like, for example, let's say I have a let's say I have something like this. Emphasis. Whoa. End emphasis. And I gave this the class special strong for whatever reason. If I go back into my browser and look at this, hey, look, we know that the special strong rule is now being matched to this EM. And we know that because he has a class of special strong, and this class selector will select it. But what if we only wanted to select elements of type EM that had the special strong class? Well, that's where combining selectors comes into play. What I can do here is I can say, okay, let's start with the basics. I want to start with emphasis. I only want to select emphases. Emphases. Wow. Is that a word? Emphases? I mean, I guess in the context of HTML it would be a word because emphasis is an element. Can you have plural emphasis? I don't know. So we start with our emphasis, and then I add in a class selector. Notice how there's no space between these two selectors. So we're not doing a descendant, we're actually combining them. We are saying, give me every single EM element that has the class of special strong. And if I refresh, look at that, it turned yellow. It's a really horrible color choice, you can barely see it, but believe me, even if you can't see it because of video compression, that is yellow. Maybe I should make it purple instead. There we go. And it's purple. So again, we can combine selectors. So we can combine our class selectors with our element selectors with our ID selectors, and we can nest them. We can define descendant relationships, immediate descendant relationships. We can throw in pseudo selectors, and we could have a really fun time selecting every single element on this page uniquely, if we wanted to. So that's the power of CSS, is being able to select elements uniquely. So I highly encourage people to practice this. We will be, the homework for today will be mainly a quiz, I guess you could say, of how you can actually go about taking this document and selecting items uniquely with as few changes to the markup as possible. Actually, there is one more selector that I want to do. Or it's not even a selector. There's one more thing I want to do. Let's say I wanted all of my H1 tags and all of my H2 tags to be blue. Hold on. Come on. There we go. I want all of my H1 tags and all of my H2 tags to be blue. How would I do that? Well, H1, comma, H2. You can separate selectors by commas. So technically these are two selectors, but they're both in the same rule, meaning these properties will be applied to any element that matches this selector or this selector. Okay, that's it. And when I said quiz, what I mean is it's the way I design the homework is I just want people to get in the habit of being able to look at an HTML document and saying, oh, if I want to select this element and only this element, how would I go about doing that? Sometimes it requires such convoluted CSS that I would just say, just throw a class on it. Throw a class on it and throw an ID on it maybe, but don't write, a selector that's 200 characters long just to grab one element when you can throw a class on it. On the other hand, if you can get away with selecting something cleanly, then always prefer that over changing your markup. Okay, so let's talk about properties. I'm going to, the fun properties, the positioning properties, we're going to be talking about extensively next week. That's basically what next week is all going to be. But let's talk about some basic properties we can play with right now. And those are the font properties. Now, font properties allow us to style our font. And we see an example of it already. We have our color. So that's cool. But let's show a couple other ones. Let's say I wanted to, I wanted this p tag to be fancy. So I'm going to give this p tag a fancy class. And then I'm going to say every p tag that has the fancy class, I want to give it a font weight of bold, a text decoration, I don't know, let's give it a line through. Let's give a font style of italic. Let's give a font size of 42 points. Let's give a text align of justify. This is going to look awful. And let's give it a text shadow of 0px, 0px, 5px red. And finally, let's give it a color of blue. Okay, this is going to look awful. Check that out. We just styled some text. Now, there's not a whole lot that I can really talk about what I just did. And the reason there isn't a lot to talk about is because these are just these properties. I mean, it's just a matter of knowing the properties. There are plenty of references online, particularly the Mozilla Developer Network has a great extensive list of all the properties we can use in CSS. And it's just a matter of learning them all, because they all follow basically the same syntax. So first of all, we have a font weight property. Well, font weight makes things bold, or it makes things not bold. That's all font weight does. Next up, we have a text decoration of line through. Text decoration gives us a variety of different things like blink, line through, overline, and underline. You'll typically see line through and underline used most often. Font style allows us to make things italic, or this word that I don't know how to pronounce, and is basically like not italic, or but kind of italic. I'm not a typographer. Is that a word, typographer? No idea. But I'm not one of those if they exist. So anyway, we can make things italic. We can give things font sizes. We can give things font sizes in terms of points, pixels. So that's 30 pixels for the font size. We can give things font sizes in EMs. EMs are very interesting. They're a relative unit. What I'm saying is I want this font size to be 6 times however much its parent is. And you can also do percentage if you wanted to. So I could say 60%. And now it's very tiny. Next up, we have text align justify. We can align to the left, to the right, or we can justify it, or we can center it if we wanted to. So I could say text align equals center. That does exactly what you think it would do. It centers our text. Woo. Now, centering text is not the same thing as centering elements. We'll talk about that more in depth next week. Next up, we have a text shadow. That's a new CSS 3 feature. Text shadow, we can pass in the X offset, the Y offset, the blur radius, and the color. So if I wanted right now you see my shadow is completely centered on my text. If I wanted to move my shadow 10 pixels to the right, I would do that. And now it's moved 10 pixels to the right. You can actually even apply multiple text shadows if you're crazy. I can go ahead and do another text shadow by putting in a comma there. Let's center it right on the element. Or actually no, let's give it negative 10 px for the X and 0 px for the Y. And let's give it a blur radius of 3 px, sure, and make it green. And just so we can see this better, I'm going to bring my font size up to 2 EM. And take a look at that. It looks like a poor attempt at making 3D. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that yes, you can do text shadow and we can do colors. And these are not the only properties that we have in CSS. We have a lot of properties. But most of these properties are about positioning, which again, I've discussed we're not actually talking about today. We're focusing mainly on selectors, but I wanted to give people something fun to play with. So here you go, we can style text like this. We could also do this to the entire page if you wanted to. Instead of selecting on p.fancy, I could select on body. And then we get something straight out of GeoCities. So you'll notice that each one of these elements is going to be styled this way because I've applied the style to body. All of these properties will be applied to itself as well as its child elements. Okay, so that's just some fun stuff you can play with. It's not terribly important. Again, when you learn CSS, it's all about knowing the individual properties you can play with. And this isn't a particular class about properties. This is all about selectors. And we have right here a selector of p.fancy, meaning it'll select every single p tag that has the class of fancy. Okay, let's go ahead and so this is the section on style sheets, particularly the section on selectors. Let's do one more fun thing with selectors. And that has to do with how classes work. So let's say that, so I have this p.fancy, and let's say I have another p.fancy. Oh, come on. Come on. There you go. So I have two elements with the class of fancy, but let's say that I wanted one of the fancy elements to be mostly fancy, but maybe a little fancier. I wanted to inherit every single style from the fancy element, or the fancy selector, but I want to change one or two things about it. Elements can have as many classes as you want. That's how you achieve an inheritance with CSS. See, on a typical language, you might want to say, okay, well, what if I did p.fancy-2 inherits from p.fancy? If you're a programmer, you'll know what the syntax is. This is not valid CSS. And there's no way to do this in CSS. But we can accomplish the same thing by writing another style that just overrides one of our, or how about doesn't override it? How about we just want to apply a text shadow? Hold on. There we go. We only want to apply a text shadow on p.fancy2s, but we want to apply all this other fancy stuff on p.fancies. What we can do is we can actually, or how about this? Let's do super fancy. Okay, so what's going on here? I have a P fancy class. So if I go ahead and refresh this, notice how this fancy is a little fancy, but this one has that crazy blue and green text shadow. Well, how exactly is this working? Well, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I have one element right here that has one class called fancy. Then I'm creating another element and it has two classes, super and fancy. Then in my style sheet, I'm saying, okay, I want to select every P tag or P element that has the class fancy and give it these fancy parameters. But then I want to find everything that has the fancy class and the super class, and I want to give it this property. And this is what we get. Okay, so how's everyone doing with having multiple classes on an element? So that is fancy.super, no space. Yes, there's no space here. And it could be in any order. The order does not matter. I could say p.super.fancy, or I could say p.fancy.super. It does the exact same thing. So again, even if you don't use the most complicated selectors that you are aware of, having the understanding of the process you typically go through when styling a web application is very important. And that is, you typically start off with an HTML document, like what we did before. Last week, we created an HTML document. And then we went through and said, okay, well, I want this element to be blue, and I want this element to be red, and I want this element to be massive for some reason. I want every single small to be big for some reason. So you go through that process of figuring out, okay, what things do I want to style? And then you write selectors that select out those things you want to style, and then you give them properties. And that's it. That's all web design is. All that's left is learning about the other properties that we can use inside of our rules. And even if people right now are struggling with the concept of selectors, just practice it. Don't be discouraged. We're just looking at an overview of this stuff right now. It won't be solidified until you go about typing it out and watching the process of creating a website actually happen. Okay. We did get a question. Can you do something like fancy.star? You can. It won't have any effect though, except for now fancy can be applied to any element. The star is a special element selector, and it means any element, which means star.fancy is the exact same thing as just .fancy. This selector and this selector are the exact same thing, other than this selector has slightly more weight than this selector. But I don't want to select every single element with the fancy. I only want to select P elements with the fancy. Because what if I wanted strong elements? Whoops. What if I wanted fanny? What if I wanted fancy strong elements that were purple? Well, I could do strong.fancy. That means any strong element that I apply the fancy class to becomes purple. Or, if I wanted everything that was fancy, regardless of element, I could just remove the P dot from there. And hold on, I'm having some problems. Oh, wonderful. There we go. We now have my strong fancified. Okay, so that was just a quick run through of the different kinds of selectors we have available to us. There's one more thing that I want to talk about today, then we'll move on to questions, and that is the Chrome Developer Tools. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and leave this up here on the screen. I'm going to fire up style.css, and we're going to go on a 10-minute break. And we're back. So we talked about our selectors, and selectors are the most important thing I believe that CSS offers you, because if you can't figure out how to select a particular element, then you can't style it. CSS is all about selecting elements and giving them properties, and in a nutshell, that is exactly what CSS is. If you go to 3dbuzz.com and you check it out and you turn off your styles, you will see a very basic HTML document, because that's all it is. It's a basic HTML document with styles applied to it. How do those styles get applied? Well, they get selected. Don't worry if some of the more advanced selectors are maybe a little bit complicated right now. The most important thing to do is to practice. And I highly encourage people to follow along with this video and type out the particular examples that I have already put together, because once you get a handle on selecting, then that's more than half the battle of learning how to work with CSS. So yeah, don't worry if some things are confusing right now, but I just wanted to give an overview of the different kinds of selectors, so that maybe, maybe just down the line you're working with an HTML document and you're like, oh, I don't know how to select this element. How do I select it? Oh, I vaguely remember something about a immediate descendant selector, so I'll go reference that. That's what I'm trying to do here, is to give people a sort of vocabulary, even if obviously I'm not expecting people to put in a whole lot of practice during the video, at least as far as the live classes go. So the last thing I want to wrap up on today is something that I debated very much about showing you guys at the beginning of this class. The reason is I'm about to show you guys a tool that will make this process of writing documents, writing HTML documents and styling them very, very, well, not easy, but easier once you learn how to use this tool. So let's jump into this little page right here. Let's go ahead and hit F12. Now, I'm using Chrome, and Chrome has a built-in developer console that we can take advantage of that gives us a crazy amount of functionality. There exists a developer console similar to this on every major browser. Firefox has one, Internet Explorer has one, Safari has one, but I think you have to actually enable it in your advanced settings or something, because Apple is like that. But this is going to be one of the most important tools that you will use, other than a text editor, when writing web pages. So let's talk about it. When I hit F12 on Chrome, I get this little guy right here, and I can toggle it on and off with F12. And he has a bunch of tabs, and the ones that we're going to be talking about today is the Elements tab and the Network tab. These two tabs is where you're going to be spending most of your time. The Element tab shows you this. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, that looks like my HTML document. And guess what? It does, but it's actually not your HTML document. What you're looking at is the document object model. You're looking at the result of your browser reading through this HTML and understanding it, and then presenting it to you in a hierarchy that you can navigate very easily on. So the reason I differentiate the DOM, or the document object model, from the HTML page is that the DOM may be manipulated during your page's execution. Now, we won't be talking about that in this particular class, but I want to keep in mind that if you jump over into an application like even BuzzNet, and you open up your developer console, you'll see something a little bit different than what you would see if you hit View Source on the document. So I just wanted to make that distinction, but it's not too important right now. So what we're looking at is our document object model. And we can expand all of our elements and actually go in and click on them and get a bunch of really interesting information on them. For example, watch what happens when I hover over the word body. Notice how the page is now highlighted, and that's because everything's pretty much in the body. Then watch what happens when I mouse over header. We now get our header, and now I can go ahead and go into H1, and we see our H1. So that's really neat. This allows us to actually take a really hard look at what our document is actually looks like to our browser, but the features do not even get close to starting there. We will be using this tool extensively next week when we talk about our box model. But for now, what you can use it for is, let me go ahead and find my stuff. So let's take a look at my stuff. I've now located my stuff element, and I've clicked on strong. And look at this. We have our styles right here. This shows every single style that has been applied to this element in order of precedence. I will backtrack for one quick second. Some people are asking about Firefox. If you're using Firefox, go over to getfirebug.com and download this extension. So just hit install Firebug. Firebug is the equivalent to this in Firefox, but honestly, I've grown to very, very much appreciate the Chrome developer tools. So we can go in, but again, the stuff doesn't stop there. Look at this. We can see matched CSS rules. So we can actually look at it and say, hey, this strong element is being matched by this rule, and these are the properties that are being applied to it. But you guys want to have your mind blown? You can actually go in and edit. Now, that doesn't actually edit the style sheet. You would have to already go and you'd have to go in and you have to manually modify your style sheet if you wanted this change to persist. Like, for example, if I hit refresh, notice how that goes away. But the important thing is you can actually sit here and fiddle with your properties in real time and watch the result of it. And I can also use my mouse wheel. So watch as I move up and down on my mouse wheel. I'm changing the font size of my stuff. So that's cool. What else can we do? Well, we can turn off things if we wanted to. See this little checkbox right here? We can click on that and turn it off. Now notice how it doesn't actually modify my stuff right here. And we can see why that is. If I turn off my font weight bold on my fancy rule, notice how we still have this font weight bold being applied, but this is being applied from the user agent style sheet. User agent is just a fancy word for web browser. So that's why turning off the bold doesn't affect this strong element, but it does affect this element. So you can do a lot of fun stuff with this. Let's talk about how we can select elements using our developer tools. There's a couple ways. The way that I use most frequently is you can right-click on any element in the entire page. So let me right-click on item 1, and I can go all the way down to inspect element. Click on that, boom. I am now looking at my H2. So that's awesome. There's another way to do it. You see this little magnifying glass right here? If you click on the magnifying glass, you can hover over any element in the page, and when you click, it'll automatically select it. But it doesn't actually stop there. There's so many things you can do with this. Like, for example, I can go into my H1. Notice how my H1 doesn't have any styles applied to it. Now it does have my user agent style sheet applied to it, of course, because the user agent style sheet is always applied. But I can go up here into my element styles and I can add in anything I want. So I can go ahead and give it a color of red if I wanted to. Now again, remember, this doesn't modify your source, meaning if I were to hit refresh, that change would go away. But we can do anything we want, so I can give it a normal font weight if I wanted to. to our page, and we can see the changes happen in real time. You can also modify your DOM. This is a little bit more of an advanced feature, but watch this. I can click and drag my H1, and I can move it from my section into my header if I wanted to. So I just moved the element from my section into my header. This isn't what you would ever want to do, but you can do it. See? I can move this H1 wherever I want to. Ooh, NATO, I'll answer, or Harry, I'll answer that in a second. But yeah, so I just wanted to give a quick overview of this. This is your friend. Learn it, use it. This is the most important web development tool you have in your disposal, period. There's a lot of other fun stuff you can do with it that's completely out of the scope. For example, I could go in here and I can look at my metrics. I can see the box model of my element if I wanted to. We'll talk about the box model next week. I can look at my properties, so my JavaScript properties. We'll talk about those in our JavaScript class. I can modify styles, move elements around. I could delete elements if I wanted to. I can show and hide elements. It's just a lot of fun, and it will be very important. Keep in mind, though, one thing that you will have to remember is that any modification you make does not get applied to your source code. It's only for tinkering purposes only. But it's also a very important tool for being able to tinker with your site in real time. Yeah, it's basically the Unity editor in play mode. One more important aspect to this particular thing, again, there's a lot of fun stuff we can do with it, but the last thing I'll talk about real fast is computed style. And then if I go to computed style and say show inherited, I can look at every single CSS property that there is, and I can see its value on this element. Whether that value came from the web browser, or it came from my style sheets, or it came from JavaScript, no matter where it came from, I can see exactly what every single CSS property is on this element. This is a wonderful debugging tool. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce that. We will be making heavy use of it next week. The other one I want to go ahead and look at, again, people are asking about what's WebKit, why are there dashes here? I'll talk about that in a second. That is kind of important, but I don't want to talk about it quite yet. So if we go into network, this is the second most important tab that you'll ever use on this tool. And I want to point out one caveat of network is that network will only start tracking your network activity until you open your actual developer tools. See how I closed it and opened it again, now it's blank? Well, look down here, it says no requests captured. Reload the page to see detailed information on network activity. So if I reload the page, look what we get. We get our test.html and we get our styles.css. That's because our web browser requested test.html and the web server returned it as a HTML document. But then, because we have a link tag in here, our browser was like, oh, wait a sec, we have an external resource we need. Let's make another request to the web server and get our styles.css. So our network tab allows us to see every single external resource that our program has asked for, and also gives us this cool little timeline that allows us to see how long it took to load and parse particular resources. You'll also notice if I click on this and go to headers, it'll give you the request URL of everything. So here's the request URL of test.html, here's the request URL of styles. If you are ever in a position where a style sheet isn't loading properly, your first stop is the network tab. Because watch this. If I go back into my HTML and I put in a completely invalid path and go back to my Chrome Developer Tools and refresh, look at that. We get an error. So we can actually see if our style sheets were actually loaded or not. And we can click on this and see, okay, what were you requesting? Oh, you were requesting week 2 slash blah, 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 blah. So yeah, a very important tab to keep in mind when you're working with external resources. The network tab includes everything. It includes images, scripts, styles, AJAX requests. Where did my window? I think I closed my window. Did I close my window? Or am I just going insane? I might just be going insane. Give me 1 second. Let me go ahead and reopen my window. And hide my VM because it's... There we go. Okay, so your first stop whenever you can't load something is your network tab, because your network tab shows every resource that's been requested by your browser. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up everything that I wanted to cover today. We'll have a section for Q&A when I stop the video. But before I stop the video, there's one sort of ancillary thing that I wanted to discuss. It's not a super important thing, but it may clear some stuff up as you start going through your Chrome developer tools. The first thing that a lot of people noticed is if I look at some of my user agent style sheets, you see stuff like this, -webkit, -margin, -after. What is this? Well, whenever we have a CSS property that has a dash in it as the first character, followed by a rendering engine, that is a vendor-specific prefix, which means it's a CSS property that only applies to a particular browser vendor. Okay, well, I mean, that makes sense. If you want to do something just for IE, or they use this a lot for experimental features like box shadows and rounded corners and stuff like that. All the CSS3 stuff that hasn't even been standardized yet, but browser vendors have been making available in their browsers, they're all prefixed with their browser vendor. But what's that WebKit right there? Well, WebKit is the rendering engine of Google Chrome. So Google Chrome is a browser. It is a browser. It's the thing that you use to browse the web. But it actually makes use of a open source HTML rendering system or rendering engine called WebKit. WebKit is used by Safari and Google Chrome and a variety of other browsers that are in use today, particularly stuff like mobile Safari, Android browsers, and so on, all use WebKit. And so does Chrome. Internet Explorer uses a rendering engine called Trident. Firefox uses a rendering engine called Gecko. And Opera uses, I think they use their own rendering engine. But not for long, actually. Google is moving away from WebKit and creating their own rendering engine called Blink. And the next version of Opera and the next major version of Chrome are both going to move away from WebKit and use Blink instead. So again, WebKit is the rendering engine of Chrome, which is why if something works on Chrome, it is very likely going to work on quite a few different browsers because they all use the same rendering engine, WebKit. However, Chrome also doesn't use any available JavaScript engine. Google wrote their own JavaScript engine called V8 and open sourced it. And last count I heard that it's the fastest, still the fastest JavaScript engine ever written. So yeah, so if you ever see WebKit, just know that that's just based off of how Chrome is. It was built off another product. So I think that's just about it. Just to quickly recap, we talked about, we reviewed what we talked about last week. We talked about what HTML is. It's a way to present structured data to something, but usually a web browser. Almost always a web browser. Then we talked about links or anchors and how we can link to other pages on our web server, which is very important because the whole point of the web is that it's interconnected by these hyperlinks. Then we dived into style sheets. And style sheets, again, I'm not going to say that they're simple. Well, they are simple. They have simple components to them, but they can be used to express very complicated things. So if you find yourself in a position where you have difficulty understanding CSS, when I say it's simple, I don't mean, oh, you're stupid for not understanding it. What I'm saying is that CSS is just a combination of a few building blocks that are combined in more complicated ways to produce a result. And those building blocks with CSS at a high level is just a selector or multiple selectors followed by properties, and that's it. I'm not saying that CSS will always be simple or easy, because you can get very complicated with this. But if you have difficulty understanding a particular CSS rule, break it down into its components and realize that all you're looking at is a collection of selectors followed by a collection of properties. We talked about the ID selector, class selector, element selector. We talked about descendants and immediate descendants. We talked about selector weight. Then we talked about a few different selector properties, or sorry, CSS properties, particularly the ones that allow us to alter the presentation of text, because those are the simplest to understand. And then we fired up the Chrome Developer Tools, which is the, again, very important tool for web development of any kind. So I think that about wraps everything up. What I want people to do is, if we go into our example.html, first of all, I want people to split their pages in a way that you see right here. I want people to have an add an item button that goes to an add item page, and then a back to to-do list, which brings you back to the main application. Then I want people to perform a few different styles, and I'll define these in writing after class. But to give you an idea, I want people to apply global fonts to everything. I want people to select the page header and give it unique font styles. I want people to uniquely select section headers and give them unique styles. And then I want people to also select the deleted items and give them special styles, the strong items, give them special styles, and also give the footer special styles. What properties you actually use are irrelevant. This class in particular wasn't about the properties of CSS as much as it was about selecting elements with CSS. So I think that just about wraps everything up. So to all you future people, I will see you next week.